Gary, thanks. Gary, thank you. That's a very generous introduction, and I will do my best this evening to live up to at least a bit of it. I have to apologize, though. The only thing that's gone wrong with my Berlin stay is I've acquired a cold. And so particularly for those in the back of the room, if my voice at any moment trails off, please put your hand up and I will try to speak more loudly and at least have a chance to allow you a chance to hear what I have to say this evening. Gary, first of all, though, I need to thank you. Thank you for the hospitality that you showed Judy and me, for putting together this extraordinary evening, of permitting me to reconnect with some old friends, and to meet again several new ones. This is a very special privilege. In this room sit great academicians, diplomatists, men of business, the press. All of you know yourselves, so I won't try to identify each one of you, but I'm also particularly honored, Mr. Ambassador, knowing my affection for Egypt, to have you here this evening as well. Gary rightly stressed the fact that I was a friend of Richard Holbrooke's, and I hold that as one of the dearest associations of my life and warmest memories. And it went back, as Gary described it, to 1964, and it became multi-generational. My mother cared very deeply for Richard. She used to call him that Holbrooke, for all of us knew what a force of nature, a fountain of energy, but a man with statesmanlike vision. I was with him when he was ambassador here, and when he began to reflect on this city and on the meaning of the United States in Berlin. It was at that time that we were contemplating the exit of our forces from this brave city, and Richard Holbrooke felt at that time and argued eloquently that we had to leave something behind of the United States that would be of enduring value. And he came upon the idea of a center of reflection, of dialogue, that would continue to connect into the years ahead the United States, Germany, but particularly Berlin, which he loved. I heard him. I marveled at the thought that out of thin air you could create something that didn't exist, that you could mobilize Henry Kissinger and the former chancellor to come and launch it, to raise the money. But like everything Richard Holbrooke did, once he set his mind on it, he didn't give up. And he said, one day you will go there. I'm only sad that I can't have done it during his lifetime, but I did speak to his widow on the eve of my departure, and she was very pleased that finally this particular promise, commitment that Richard had made to me and I in return to him, would finally be possible. So the remarks I deliver this evening will by no means measure the standard of Richard Holbrooke's insights and dynamism in foreign affairs, but they are in large measure dedicated to him. I am taking on a subject that he did not spend a great deal of time, for many reasons. But the Middle East was always dear to me, and he would turn to me on frequent occasion and say, fill in that gap for me. And I'd try, usually inadequately. His questions were always much better than my answers. And I'm afraid that particular lacunae I will share with you again tonight. There are many more questions as we head into the third year, into the fourth year. Full 3 years have passed since the tidal wave of revolution swept through the Arab world, pushing aside governments in Tunisia and Egypt, in Libya and Yemen, challenging others very deeply, Syria, Bahrain, Egypt herself has experienced not one but two governments, and the wave has swept on beyond those most immediately affected, causing deep political adjustments in Morocco, Jordan, Kuwait. Others, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, have been forced to modify their internal situations, shore up their defenses and their regional ties. The tide is, as we all know, still running, and it's going to run for a while. In fact, as we enter this, the fourth year of this region-wide outburst, it is even more unpredictable than at any time since its beginning. We have little way of knowing where this year will end, what kind of stability will be in place in the region, and beyond the region, how far the tidal wave of revolution will spread. Countries as distant as Mali have already experienced the side effects of the Arab crisis. I think as I look back, and I suspect all of you do, we've come into some degree of focus. What caused this outburst of revolutionary fervor? The national security states that dominated Middle Eastern politics since the 1950s were, by 3 years to 4 years ago, tone deaf, not listening, often afflicted with corruption, institutions that had never been fully developed, and their time had come when history rang its bell. But we often overlook some of the other ingredients in the Arab awakening, the Arab Spring, as it's sometimes called. An additional ingredient, as I look back on it, is the Sunni Shia sectarian divide, which first came to light earlier in 1977, in the time of the Iranian Revolution, and spread beyond that to Iraq, to Lebanon, to Bahrain, and in fact beyond the immediate Arab world's borders to Afghanistan and Pakistan, upsetting the region's balance of power, fueling the current crisis in Syria, and leading to a region-wide contest between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Long marginalized Shia populations have wakened themselves, brought on by the example of the Iranian Revolution, by Iranian actions, and the projection of Iranian power. And those awakenings have had a fueling effect on this Arab period. And they're not alone. There are other minorities, national minorities, that have come awake during the course of the crisis: the Kurds in Syria and Iraq, the Berbers in North Africa. If you put it all together, you have to stand back and say, this is a real cauldron. And where is it headed? Will it emerge in the Middle East from its present cycle of revolution, more or less democratic, more or less tolerant, more or less willing to live with its religious diversity, its minorities? Where will women be? What will be the role of free markets in the regional economies? In short, what kind of structure of stability can emerge in the region? But it won't only be about the region itself, but it's about us as Western powers. It's about Turkey, Iran, about Russia, about China. What will be the emerging balance of power between outside players and actors? Specifically, as I think about my own country, and I probably reflect the same as I think about Germany's choices, our assumptions and our policies set over some 40 years have been upended. And where are we headed? Where are we going to go in our own thinking? None of these questions can obviously be answered in the short run, and it's going to take years. But I think each of us can agree on one firm premise, and that is the Middle East matters. This evening, in the course of my remarks, I will try to outline a framework for understanding what we're going through, the circumstances we face, and then try to draw a few conclusions about where the United States and our European friends, how we might proceed. I'm going to basically emphasize two broad themes. First, I'm going to look at the question of stability, without which there can be no future for any of us in the region, not to mention the region's peoples. And second, how do you build a structure of peace? Put it differently, how do you build a balance of power again inside the region? But let me start with the opening problem of stability. While instability is the dominant feature in today's Middle East, Syria is the most dramatic, the most dangerous, and the most immediate problem. Long center of Arab consciousness and Arab history, Syria has played quite a remarkable role in the modern Middle East. It has been a spoiler for the past 40 years in many different ways. It had the unique capacity, its governments have had the unique capacity of being the region's foremost arsonist and at the same time firefighter. The Syrian state has intervened in virtually every quarrel in the region and manipulated its role to its own advantage, bringing foreigners like my government time and again to Damascus's gates to try to settle the problems of the region, or at least manage them. All of us needed Syria to maintain the peace. And what an irony it is today, having exported difficulty throughout the region, today Syria is the beneficiary of the furies of the Arab awakening. What started as a pro-democracy demonstration in Deraa in 2011 is now a full-scale civil war, and a Pandora's box has been opened in Syria that won't be closed anytime soon. But to understand Syria, you have to focus on one key fact, and that is the role and history of the Alawite community. For centuries, marginalized, on the outskirts of power, neglected, left aside. With the advent of the French and the ability of the Alawites to join the French regional forces of the day, they became the originators of much of the officer corps, and under the Assad family on the 13th of May in 1970, they took power. They eliminated their rivals in the Ba'ath Party and established a family-led regime. The ranks of the military and security services after that became largely an Alawite property, and through the control of the security services, the community itself prospered in manners that it had never known throughout its history. It is an Alawite-led phenomenon. But let us also remember that Syria is much more complex than we've been ordinarily able to discern. It's not simply about Alawites and Sunni and Christians. For each one of these communities is subdivided, shattered. The lines are not neatly drawn. If all Sunnis, for example, believed that it was time for Assad to go, he would not be there. And large numbers of soldiers serving in the government's ranks are Sunni. So Syria is not an easy place, but what you have is a civil war in which Syrians are bitter, humiliated, vengeful, massacred children, women, ruined cities, religious institutions defiled. It's a real mess. And into this mess has flown now a serious challenge to all of our interests, the radical offshoots of Al-Qaeda, Jabhat Nusra, and Daesh. And these, I suggest, are a principal threat for all of us to worry about. I assume that one day, sooner or later, in some form, the present government of Bashar al-Assad will go. I also know that the Russians and Iranians know this. We're not alone in that perception. But there is, in my judgment, only one way to reach that point and to achieve an end to the civil war, and that is a political outcome. This is not a war that can be won. And what Kofi Annan tried to launch in Geneva in 2012 and has been pursued doggedly since then by Lakhdar Brahimi, there is only one way forward, a negotiation with preconditions. And while I'll say it again, those preconditions should never have included the early departure of the Syrian president. The prospects today for a negotiated settlement, even if it is an imperative, are really very poor. Geneva II's failure leaves us all more than somewhat disheartened. It leaves Assad pursuing military advantage with his Hezbollah ally, with backing from Iran and from Russia, hoping that he can outweigh or outlast his opponents and impose a quiet, if not a enforced continuation of his rule. But the response that we're developing is also inadequate. Increased arms supplies may slow the pace of the violence in Assad's favor, but they're not fundamentally going to change it, nor can he find a way out through presidential elections that are not agreed to by the parties. And so I'd like to suggest to all of us tonight that it's worth going back, sitting down and rethinking what constitutes Geneva and figure out exactly what it is we're trying to achieve. Why did Geneva II fail? There are two distinct American contributions: our continued commitment to the early departure of Assad, but also our unwillingness to involve the Iranians. So what are the principles that I would recommend all of you think about? The first is pretty simple. Geneva must be organized around the principle that Syria's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and unity continue. It proceeds as well, second, from a commitment of the United States and Russia, but it includes Europe, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. All have to be involved in Geneva. Third, the United Nations needs to be the convener in venue. It is obviously not the problem solver. Fourth, what priorities should be pursued? The first, I would argue, is a ceasefire or series of ceasefires. The second is humanitarian relief. And then third, the convening of an all parties, Syrian community leaders and parties to the discussion of transitional arrangements, which would lead finally to a cessation of hostilities, a termination of outside equipment and finance and personnel, and eventually free elections and the elaboration of a constitution. These principles strike me as key, but they're based on two assumptions. One is that Assad will be part of the transition, perhaps not part of the outcome, but going in, there's no way you can achieve a transition without his cooperation. And the second core assumption on my part is that one way or another, we have to keep our sights set on marginalizing the Islamic radicals. A tall order, but a strategy is essential, and these elements, I would suggest, are part of it. The second great issue of stability in the region is Egypt. At the outset of the Arab Revolution and the turmoil in Egypt, it appeared there and elsewhere that an Islamic political tide was rising and would gain ascendancy, if not through all of the region, through significant parts of it. The success of the Muslim Brothers in the first set of elections in the Arab world's largest state fed that perception of inevitability and direction. But appearances, as we all know, can prove to be deceptive, and thank heavens in Egypt's case, they were. Egypt and Tunisia both have sent different signals, but the key signal comes from Egypt, which is essential to the region's future, to peace with Israel, to almost every other major issue that we face, Egypt is at the heart of it. It is the key to stability and the restored balance of power in the Middle East, and so it has been throughout history, and so it has been specifically over the past 30 years since Anwar Sadat took Egypt out of the Soviet orbit and headed it westwards. Egypt has gone through hell. Over the last several years since Mubarak fell from power and turned reins of power over to the military in 2011. But Egypt did not succumb to the sort of violence that we've witnessed in Syria or in Libya or in Yemen. And it didn't for many reasons. Its ethnic composition, its religious order are very different. And on top of it, Egypt enjoys a mature system of armies, police, bureaucracies, judiciaries, press that are almost unique in the Arab world, that give a certain inherent stability to the society. What Egypt did not have was a mature political culture in which power is shared and respect for opposition is part of the political culture. And Egypt is today paying a price for that failure to develop. And so today, Egypt's jails are quite packed. Some 15,000 members of the Muslim Brotherhood or their sympathizers are reportedly behind bars. Incidents of violence continue sporadically in Cairo, diminishing, but still continue in Egypt's cities, in Upper Egypt, and in the northern Sinai. A different set of crises are underway that leave that region in the throes of a major insurgency. Dissident journalists and political activists have been arrested, and then as we all know, quite recently, an Egyptian judge in the upper Egyptian city of El Minya condemned about 525 or so people to death in trial proceedings that hardly meet Western standards. But is this the whole story? I'd argue with you it is not. And to judge Egypt today, you need to look at it from a different angle. First and most important point is that Egypt is emerging from a time of turmoil, a time in which the patience and well-being of Egyptians across the board was tested, and they want stability. If I wonder about a commitment to stability, I'm also the first to recognize, and I suspect you would agree with me, that the first victim of instability is human rights. And that proved to be the case in Egypt. The value systems of the Muslim Brothers were hardly going to be compatible with the extension of human rights. There is an opportunity to change that reality now. But let's also remember specifically what has occurred. A political roadmap has been written, a constitution drawn up with generous respect for core rights and religious freedoms. Elections are in the offing, first for the presidency and then for parliament. Egypt is beginning to recover a modicum of stability, and frankly, from my point of view, that's important to all of us with interests in the region or who wish to see, finally, the triumph of democratic principles. The challenges, though, ahead are absolutely awesome. Egypt's economy has regressed over the past 3 years. Growth rates are at a standstill in the face of rising numbers of young Egyptians seeking jobs. Inflation runs well above 10%. Nearly 70% of the economy operates off the books. The government's budget is mortgaged to fuel and food, subsidies, government salaries, defense and security costs. There's no investment program taking place that will give Egypt prospects for the future and the youth a chance to find a job. But I can assure you Egypt has resources. The question is how to create stability so those resources can be mobilized and put to work. Egypt's challenge today is to do precisely that and make its economy function. For the rest of us, Egypt's centrality remains critically important. And the challenge to me is for all of us not to look back on these recent years as much to look forward and strike a new deal with Egypt and figure out how we will be involved in preserving the stability and maintaining the progress of this great and important country. What are those principles? The first and most important to keep in mind is the commitment we all have and need to continue to have with Egypt, and that's the maintenance of peace with Israel. Second is the reestablishment of a political dialogue with Egypt that addresses the instability of Libya, the civil war in Syria, the increasingly problematic issue of waters in the Nile coming out of Ethiopia and flowing through Sudan and South Sudan, the situation in both of those countries, and even Iran's role in the region. Any of us who do not believe that Egypt plays a critically important role in the stability of the Gulf don't understand Middle Eastern history. The third issue is economic growth. There is a vital need for Egypt to focus on budget discipline, job creation, education, and infrastructure development. And there's a role for all of us to play in that. And finally, it's the question of democratic principles. Egypt's fate is tied to its ability, eventually, over time, to bind up its wounds and rebuild a tolerant, inclusive society. Egypt will not be a whole, and most Egyptians recognize it, until it comes to terms with the approximately 20% of its people who've looked to the Muslim Brothers. How this objective will be achieved is not yet fully clear. Will all Egyptians accept the maintenance of peace as the starting point? And where will that take them politically? But I would like to suggest that talking with Egypt about her democratic principles is fully within the realm of what we ought to be about. And so we face in Syria, in Egypt, but elsewhere, well beyond, in Libya and Yemen, I could list many more, the critical question of stability. But restoring stability alone cannot be the sole objective of American, Western policy. Conditions for peace in the region need to be set. And I'd like to talk about two of those challenges. The first is, of course, what we're living through today, the Israel-Palestine negotiation. None of us need to be reminded of its centrality in the Arab world. The centrality of the Arab-Israeli dispute has been with us since the late 1940s. Nor should any of us need to be reminded of the importance of the attempts we've made to try to achieve peace. But the understanding, or failure of an understanding, between Israel and the Palestinians continues to trouble the region, inflame Arab opinion, and put essential Western interests at issue. It is for this reason that I, and I suspect all of you, wish John Kerry well in his latest attempt to forge understandings between Israel and the Palestinians. Based on a two-state solution, a one-state solution is not a viable option. The only workable option, as difficult as it is for a two-state outcome. It is with equal reason that therefore we are unnerved by reports today that the peace process is once again hitting a wall, and quarrels over prisoner exchanges, Jonathan Pollard, controversy between Abbas and Dahlan, boycott initiatives, all of these sideshows are again coming to the fore. They're all distractions, and they remind us that once again we're headed into a dark corner in which blame assignment confuses the choice of intelligent policy. So where are we? I wish I knew the answer and could tell all of you tonight. There is a great deal at stake, and the future of the Kerry initiative hangs in the balance. As I see it, there are three broad outcomes. First outcome is that there is a further call for delay and further negotiations. I've been down that road before. I think many of you would recognize that that's open door to further trouble. Each side will escalate its actions. The second is possibly that we issue some statement of principles that define where the two parties are at, try to convene them, and convince them then to negotiate directly. I'd suggest we've been there before and it doesn't work. Left to their own devices, even with external nudging, even that from the United States, overcoming the gaps and taking the risks is simply not present. I would like to see a third step, and that is for the United States to contemplate a big deal that encompasses the possibility of our being prepared to announce and lay down the outlines of a final status settlement that could even be taken back to the United Nations and converted into a Security Council resolution. A clear picture of the United States' views on the illegality of settlements, a view of the United States on the question of whether Israel must be formally accepted as a Jewish state, a point I don't agree with, and third, whether the Jordan Valley has to be part of Israel's security frontier, another point that I don't share, but on which the United States, looking at international law and political reality, should be able to declare a view. Here, I can only say to you that the challenges and the willingness of statesmen today to take big steps is distinctly lacking. I'm not arguing that we're going to get there, but I'd at least like to spell out where statesmanship could take us. But finally, let me touch on another issue core to peace in general in the region, and that is our relationship with Iran. Iran, where we face an even bigger challenge in building a structure of peace and establishing a balance of power in the region. For the past 35 years, Iran, a truly great nation in civilization and a major regional power, has stood on the edge of the international system with its legitimacy and order in question. Iran has tried to define its identity as a religiously organized society and government. It has aggressively exported its ideology. It has succeeded in stoking a revival of the hopes and fortunes of the region's Shia Muslims. It has challenged the region's balance of power, threatening Israel, Saudi Arabia, and its traditional rival Turkey. The core questions posed today, especially in Iran's efforts to secure nuclear enrichment, is whether Iran is an aggressive revolutionary power seeking to dominate the region, or whether its ambitions are more limited. Is Iran seeking to secure its sovereignty and promote the well-being of its people, aiming to share regional power, not to dominate it? I'd like to suggest that the answer to those two alternative poles is not obvious, but it's equally clear to me that Iran is changing, and it has changed, and further changes are coming along, and it's no longer even certain to me that Iran in a decade will still be clerically dominated. That said, Iran is a nation revived. It is a fact we need to recognize and accommodate. Whatever its leadership, Iran is a major force in the region and a fact in our lives. Most immediately, we have the nuclear question, and that must be resolved. Does Iran aim to achieve a nuclear weapons capability, or will, as it claims, limit its ambitions to a peaceful nuclear program? The P5+1, which is meeting literally in Vienna, has months of very tough and complex negotiations ahead before we know whether Iran will accept fully a limited, peaceful, and internationally supervised nuclear regime. But the initial signs are encouraging. Iran is respecting its interim obligations and is negotiating seriously a path to a final settlement. Without a clear outcome, we know the risks. My president has made it clear that we'll go to war if Iran is going to a bomb. Israel's intentions are even more dramatically articulated. But a nuclear agreement, I would suggest to all of you, is an essential starting point in the region's quest for balance of power. Behind the nuclear question lies the core issue of trust, without which no structure of peace anywhere in the region can be built. As matters stand today, Iran does not trust us. And we, Israel and the Arab world, many, notably Saudi Arabia, do not trust Iran. If, on the other hand, we can reach a nuclear agreement, the road opens to a broader set of understandings about the region's order. I suggest that our views today on Syria, Iraq, the Gulf, Afghanistan, and Iran's perspectives are a lot closer than many of us would suspect. To an important degree, Iran has achieved many of its goals in the area, and it may now be coming to the realization that there are limits to its power. Without an understanding with the United States and Europe, Iran cannot obtain capital, technology, access to markets, much less reduce the pressure of sanctions. Without an understanding with others in the region, especially Saudi Arabia, it will face implacable rivalries without the resources at Iran's disposal to pursue them. Is Iran, today, we have to ask ourselves, prepared to help find a balance to Sunni-Shia sectarian issues in Iraq? Is Iran ready to enter into negotiations to end the Syrian civil war, where the objective is to marginalize radicals? Is the issue of Afghanistan after the departure of Western forces, the United States, going to be one of a regime that we would all back and find possible to live with and keep the Taliban at bay? I believe the answer to many of these questions is yes. Iran's interests are quite similar to our own. And if my answer is correct, then does the road open to a less hostile dynamic with Israel and Saudi Arabia? That's not impossible. The real reward, therefore, of a nuclear agreement could be the beginning of a design of a new security architecture for the Middle East. But that's still a ways ahead of us. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past 40 years, the United States has been a dominant power in the Middle East. Our advantages began to slip about a decade ago when the prevailing Arab order began to dissolve in the face of the unresolved questions of Israel, over the rise of Iran, and then American interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, which made clear to the region the limits of American power. In the wake of the Arab Revolution, the domestic order of Arab states has been shattered. Russia has reemerged as a player. Iran's on the scene. Turkey is now a player no longer fettered by its alliance obligations to the United States and Europe. Can this region bring about stability? Can it find a way forward? I would argue the Arab crisis is a real challenge, but a challenge not only to the peoples of the region, but our statesmanship. And it comes at an awkward time, for we in Europe and the United States face real problems with our economic recovery from the late 2000s economic crisis. Our budgets are stretched, our resources are limited, our public opinions completely turned off the prospect of taking risks in a region as unpredictable as the Middle East. But I'd like to think that we can be of cooler heads and that our leaders will sit back and assess the assets and liabilities that we bring to the table. We have liabilities: lost wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, ongoing tensions surrounding the war on terror, the Palestinian imbroglio. But on the asset side, think about what we bring to the table. American power, Europe's economic assets are among the leading ones. Our ability to contain Iran, to enjoy and influence outcomes with Israel. We have much to offer, particularly on the economic and financial side, to the Arab world's new regimes. These endowments, together with the continued hold on the imagination of the region in our universities and our cultural offerings, provide us many, many, many points of leverage. So what do? I'm going to suggest in conclusion 5 steps. First, I believe that the United States and the West have to reconfigure their thinking, redefine their thinking about the region, and aim for the emergence of a balance of power. We cannot dictate the region's affairs. Our objective should be stability among its states and an orderly exit from the region's revolutionary experience. This means we have to open our doors to all who play in an established balance of power. That means Iran and Russia, China, as well as the region's regional players, notably Egypt. The heart of our quest must be stability, and stability requires the building of coalitions. Second, we need to stabilize our ties to the new regimes and focus our attention on their greatest vulnerability, which is their economies. We do not have to pay all of the bills, but we can serve as a catalyst. We need not hide our principles. We can talk about the goals of democracy and tolerance, and we can do so without being hectoring. The pursuit of principle can be part of an approach to dealing with the problems Arab societies face. Third, they're old friends in the region to whom we need to reinforce our ties. I have Saudi Arabia and the UAE very much in mind, particularly at this time of stress. Fourth, and in addition to the distractions of the Arab Revolution, the Palestinian issue remains one of importance. It will poison our relations with the region if it's not dealt with. It will also leave Israel precariously exposed, reliance on its defenses without a political way forward. And that situation, I argue with my Israeli friends, and many agree, is not sustainable over the decades. Israel's vulnerabilities will grow, and we on our own cannot save her. She's got to find a home in the region, and it cannot be achieved by force alone. Fifth and finally, I would argue we need a new relationship with Iran, not one based on sanctions and threats of violence, but on recognition that Iran is a power with legitimate interests, provided it is prepared to respect its obligations, beginning with its commitments to the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Ladies and gentlemen, I've spent much of my life in and around the Middle East. I remain devoted to it. I remain devoted to the relationships of the region and my country. I recognize that this great region, the cradle to so many civilizations, can make contributions to our modern world that we can barely imagine. It's perhaps with years that I've watched Arab nations sink deeper into poverty and repression and stagnation and debilitating power rivalries. So much more could have happened over these past 50 years. It was true for Europe, Asia, Latin America, and even for Africa. That said, and despite the difficult record, it's not time to give up. The region is awake. In the inevitability of an Islamic political crescent based on retrograde values has been called into question. The future may not be clear, but what is certain, without the events in Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia in December 2010, and Tahrir Square in Egypt in 2011 and 13, Daraa in Syria, there could have been no new chapter in Arab history, and the talents of this wonderful and rich region would have remained dormant. Indeed, think about Iran. It is shown that an Islamic society revived can make impressive strides into modernity. A new order will emerge. If we, Germans, Americans, Europeans, need to aim for that order to be based on democratic principles, tolerance, the rule of law, free market economics. It is now up to us to adapt ourselves to a region's new and volatile environment and preserve our ability to work for the region's stability, encouraging step-by-step progressive institutions that serve the interests of all of its peoples. It is equally important to shape a new balance of power in the region and at the same time preserve the ties that bind the United States and Europe to the Arab world. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been unduly calm and attentive, and I thank you for your attention. And if I can answer some questions, I'd be happy to do so.
Mr. Ambassador, hello. How do you view our American openings towards Iran at the beginning of the present administration in 2008? I mean, now with looking 6 years back, would they be what you're talking about now, or why do you think they did not succeed?
It's a very good question, but could I ask you, would you tell us your name and...
Well, I'm sorry. I thought I was the American remnant in West Berlin. I was here with the army back in the 70s, and then I worked in West Berlin as a commercial pilot, flying West Berliners through the corridors to freedom. My name is Michael Kosta, and this is the next generation, my daughter Rachel. She's wonderful. 13, and I thought it'd be a good time to start her on political discussions and lecture. Thank you very much, sir.
Good. Well, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that when Obama became president, he sent signals to Iran, the first in a number of years. And those signals were in the form of a personal letter and the greetings at the time of Nowruz and the Iranian holiday. But the signals were statements of interest, not commitments to a political strategy. And very quickly, we faced the Green Revolution, the election in Iran, and the explosion on the streets of Tehran, a story, by the way, that still requires some elucidation. The United States backed away in the face of that outbreak of violence on Tehran's streets and turned its back, and the signals diminished and disappeared. About the same time, as has too often been the case over the 30 years of the American-Iranian standoff, the government changed in Iran, and you had Ahmadinejad, who proceeded to poison the atmosphere in my country and throughout the West with his exaggerated, offensive statements. So we were back in the time of a perfect storm again. Ideas came up on the nuclear front. They were looked at, found wanting. I perhaps, for one, regret that the Brazilian-Turkish initiative could not have been given more ample exploration, but it wasn't. It took the arrival of a new administration in Iran for a new definition of Iranian policy. And that's where we are today. Rouhani's election, his cabinet, which contains more American PhDs in its ranks than even our cabinet has American PhDs, is a cabinet that seems committed to doing something about Iran's own special problems. Its economy, the demands of its 80 million citizens and the young people that are rising can't depend forever on subsidies, massive inflation rates, and it's shown some strength in dealing with those questions. But I think it's been my conclusion watching this new government at work, they recognize that dealing only with domestic without creating a stable external environment, they will not be able to sustain nor succeed. And that includes engagement with the West, for the reasons I tried to outline. At heart, sanctions are very irritating. There's no doubt about that. They are an instrument of power. But the real driving force in the thinking of this Iranian government is access to capital and technology and markets. Iran believes its future lies with the West. That's an important statement because despite our current challenges in dealing with Russia over Ukraine, Iran looks to the West, not to a future in an embrace with the Russians. And so I think we have an opportunity, but it's not an opportunity that will last forever. And it's not an opportunity means we won, you lost, you gave up. It's one in which we've got to come up with compromises. In compromises that protect dignity, compromises that protect security, compromises that build trust so that you can get on to looking at the structure of issues that trouble and roil the peace of the region. So I'm a modest optimist about where we could go, but I remain troubled by our ability to get there. After all, it's been 30-some years and many, many attempts and disappointments. There's much that argues against it. There is not a coherence in my country over Iran, and there's not a coherence in Iran over its own road forward. The attitude of the supreme leader is ambivalent. The attitude of the conservative opposition is less than ambivalent, it's hostile. So there are forces there. I don't have to itemize the forces that operate in my legislature in the United States. Other questions? Gentleman there.
Logan Pesanovsky, University of Humboldt. I'd read that the Arab Spring originally started in Tunisia as a result of an economic grievance. And my question is, if it's at all possible to speak generally of the Middle Eastern world, how much do you think, Mr. Ambassador, that the uprisings are more of a demand for economic freedoms in these countries that are seeing uprisings, or is it truly a movement toward a more democratic Middle East?
Well, I think the first critically important lesson about the Middle East is don't generalize. We have a habit of doing it. We tend to think that we can simplify our own choices if we can generalize. But the facts on the ground and even inside of countries change. Of course, they're unifying issues that link many Arabs together. But think only of Tunisia for a moment. There's been a traditional crisis in Tunisia between the coast, which is quite reasonably developed, and the interior, which has been relatively destitute. Sidi Bouzid is in the latter category. And the tension between interior and coast has been, certainly in the years I lived in Tunisia, a tinderbox fact with much greater religious fervor in the interior, much more tolerant society on the coast. When I go back and look at Tunisia in the years before 2010, I was also impressed by the extraordinary heavy-handedness of Ben Ali's regime. This was a kleptocracy of high quality. He, his family, his daughters had appropriated the assets of Tunisia in a stunning manner. And it's a small country. So everybody knew what was going on, and the anger was palpable. Ben Ali was tone deaf. He figured he pulled off his coup some years earlier with Bourguiba, and he could carry on virtually without challenge, that Tunisians were a docile people and he could get away with it. He also misunderstood that he had no effective security forces once the door was pushed on. So rather than say it's only about economics, I would argue that it's even more about politics. And the core issue, if I had to generalize, was the loss of dignity, the sense that governments took their people for granted and didn't bother to listen to them. I make that point because as I look forward now, Arab governments are in a uniquely difficult position. Populations are alive, attentive, demanding. You can put 1 to 20 million people on the streets of Cairo. If you as government make a mistake, no government can stand in the face of that. That operates as a severe break on arbitrary and brutal behavior. But at the same time, it has a downside. The tough decisions a society has to make, managing budgets, reducing subsidies that affect the ordinary lives of simple people, become really much more difficult. So while I believe there is no dialing back to the old days in Tunisia and Egypt or wherever, nor do I think the path forward is going to be necessarily an easy one. Public opinions matter, and they are aroused. Gentleman here. Right here.
Michael.
Sorry. Michael.
Thank you. Michael Stürmer, Die Welt. How does the present crisis between Russia and the West impact on the Middle East?
That's really a good question, and I wish, Michael, I had a crisp answer. But as the crisis itself is still evolving, I'm not sure I do. I tried in saying that I thought the Iranians at heart, while they'll manipulate for advantage anytime they see it, look fundamentally at the strategic choices with the West. They don't see some mythic structure of China, Russia, which they could be part of that would be in defiance of the rest. So I believe we continue to enjoy considerable assets. On the Russian side, I'm reasonably persuaded, subject to being proved wrong, which is quite often, that the Russians entered the fray on chemical weapons in Syria, on achieving a Geneva conference for their own reasons and their own interests. And they will not set those aside lightly because they're arguing with us over Ukraine and with you. They have reasons to be there. They want to preserve their access to Syria. They want to be a factor in the region. To pull back is to reduce their influence in the region. So my guess is from their side, they will say, it doesn't mean they're going to be easy partners. They haven't been easy partners so far. But it does give me some reason to believe that we are going to find it possible to work with the Russians on issues related to the Middle East. I would argue, if you watch the Iran nuclear talks as a key area of Russian and P5+1 cooperation, we've had 2 rounds of discussions with the Iranians. These are obviously very complicated and very difficult and very important questions. And unless I've missed something, there's been nothing in the newspapers. Had there been a real falling out between ourselves and the Russians over strategy in these talks, I can assure you we'd have heard about it. I suspect that the coordination and the presentation of positions and ideas is going forward. I'm sure people look over their shoulders a bit, but I think there is a chance at heart to continue to work because the Russians intend to be a factor in the region and they have to get there by earning their place. Right, I think there are 2 questions here and I've missed one on this side, but you go ahead.
Andrew Guinness, I am a journalist. You spoke earlier about Syria, and you said that Assad has to be a part of the transition to peace. It seems that the situation in Syria is so complex, with so many sides, so many parties involved, all very stuck in their own way to proceed. It makes perfect sense for them to come together, but how realistic is that?
Very tough. And I don't think it would be realistic just to say, because they've been invited, they were invited into the room in Geneva too. The government and the opposition sat down at the table. But our position, and what I was explicitly critical of, was that Assad must go at the outset. And that's what I guess I don't understand and what I'm really trying to question, that if you want the Syrian regime to be part of a transition to a new stage, they have to be part of that transition. They cannot you can't eliminate the regime ab initio, and I think it was a mistake on our part to set that precondition. Rather, what I tried to argue was that the next round, whatever it is, Geneva 3, it's got to operate on the basis of no preconditions. And that includes who attends the conference. To say that Iran should not be at the table when Iran is a major factor in the situation in the country also strikes me as illogical. I believe our great problem today are the radicals and how you build coalitions in the future. That's even more complicated than how you get them to the table and get them negotiating. But I know where I want to get to. It's just going to be real tough. So your question's well asked and it has no easy answer.
Why don't we collect a few questions and then I'm going to have the last question.
Well, there are a couple of questions, please. Yeah. Yes, sir, you had one, I think.
I want to move away from the Arab Spring for a moment to the comments you made about the relationship with Israel. I think under the current demographic changes that are taking place in Israel, there is no chance that the Israeli public or the Israeli government are going to reach a two-state conclusion by themselves. So it seems to me that the answer to the question has to be that the United States and the European Union, and primarily Germany, should quietly indicate to the government of Israel that economic and support cannot go on unless there is an agreement.
Good. Did you want me to bundle that question with another one?
Just be short.
Gary, you can work many magical outcomes. Look, it is very clear to me, and I think it should be to all of us, that the will to drive through to a settlement between Palestinians and Israelis is wanting. Having said that, I have never been enamored of the prospect of trying to force a peace settlement down a party's throat, because if I go back and do any reasonable head count of peace agreements, only about 1 in 4 really survive under good circumstances. A forced settlement, assuming one could accomplish this, and I have the gravest doubts that my political system would accommodate such pressure. Assuming you even had that, then what stake would the Israelis have to carry out the agreement in good heart? I watched Israel comply with the Egyptian and with the Jordanian agreements. Much less complex than this one. But Israel entered those agreements with their eyes open and took a lot of flack, and they carried them out. This one is going to be nightmarish, uprooting populations to produce borders. It is going to be really difficult. And so, in the end, it's going to take a willing party, not a party that feels coerced. Now, that doesn't mean that events don't convince Israelis the time is right. I'd like to argue the positive. Look at this region. What threat does she pose to the state of Israel today in a security sense? Very, very limited, except the threat of instability, terror, violence, uncontrolled, broken state apparatuses that then themselves threaten the state of Israel. Is this not a really ideal time to reach out and try to accommodate? But it's going to be rough, and I have no doubt. And I believe in American leadership. I believe in what John Kerry's doing. I just want him to be bold and not hedge his bets. Was there a question there? I'm sorry. Yes? Yeah.
Thank you. Gudrun Krämer, Freie Universität Berlin. I'm saying it in German because it's the title even in English. Thank you, first of all, for your talk. I'm perhaps slightly less optimistic regarding Egypt than you were trying to be, perhaps also because of politeness, because I don't quite see the actors going in the direction of economic reconstruction and political reconstruction, particularly not among those who are in power today. But my question would be, we have had questions about all sorts of people, your thoughts on Saudi Arabia. I'd be particularly interested in light of your critical view of the Muslim Brothers. And one could argue, of course, that the Saudi Arabians, or the leadership in any event, is not so very different from Muslim Brother attitudes when it comes to major policy issues.
Well, the latter part of your question, I feel that's really easy to answer.
Yeah.
Ask the Saudis. They have very clear views on what their difference is with the Muslim Brothers. It wasn't always that way. You know the history terribly well. The Saudis opened their doors in Gamal Abdel Nasser's period to Muslim Brothers who came and established themselves. But when the Muslim Brothers began asking about the legitimacy of the Saudi kings and their right to the protection of the holy places, that was a red line that I don't think they're ever going to recover from. So I think the Saudi attitude is quite clear, and the Saudis are prepared to go quite a distance in backing Egypt in coming through this period. The other question, though, is more complex, your first question. What I was trying to say, I will now repeat very bluntly. I believe that our interests as Americans, but I'm arguing it's yours as Germans, lie in the fact that there is an entity called Egypt. I would have argued that in the time of the Muslim Brothers, though I didn't like their value structure. But Egypt is a fact. Egypt is an ancient land, and its weight on the region is consequential. I literally cannot see how you establish a structure of peace in the region without Egypt being part of it. Therefore, if we predicate our policy on waiting for a political resolution in Egypt that meets the highest standards of all of our dreams, then we sacrifice essential national interests. That does not mean that I stand by idly and pretend there are no political dynamics at work, or that my own public won't support concern for human rights and democratic principles. But I also recognize that in the chaos that Egypt has experienced, you're not going to get progress on human rights. You do have a chance with the reestablishment of legitimacy, and that we are seeing occur. Now, my final response to you, and I'm not sure I'll satisfy you, is that I find in talking to Egyptians, and being in Cairo and being in touch with Egyptians outside, that once they get over the debate about the narrative, who did what to whom when, and talk about the future, they recognize that they have a job to do themselves, and that's to figure out how they accommodate a big chunk of their society. Egyptians, in my experience, and yours is also very deep, are a people who accommodate, maybe even to their detriment. Don't move because you're stepping on somebody else's toe. But that sense of accommodation will return. It has returned in the past, but it will be done in very Egyptian ways. What it has to start with is an expectation that there is a new order in Egypt, and the resistance to that order is destabilizing, and the majority of Egyptians won't accept it. So I think there is still a lot of reconsideration to be done by the Muslim Brothers. This is not a government-only undertaking. It's going to take two for this accommodation, marriage is the wrong word, this accommodation to occur. And somewhere out in the future, we can be part of the dialogue. But if we set conditions from the outside as to the nature of the political process in Egypt, we will surely fail. And when we fail, we will have also compromised essential national interests and our ability to affect important questions like Libya and the Gulf and the Nile waters and you name it, all the areas that Egypt's influence touches upon.
I want to apologize for ending this before everybody has had a chance to ask their questions publicly, in order to give people a chance to have a more informal conversation, and also for asking my own question. First of all, I want to say I've been deeply impressed by the deep thoughtfulness and the knowledge that you've brought to all the conversations that I have heard. I also forgot to mention in my introduction, you must be very gratified by the U.S.-Iranian agreement that was brokered by Bill Burns, since you and Tom Pickering, like Burns and Mathesek, also former ambassadors to India, but also because since the Bush days administration, you and he have been the people that have basically opened the door, the back channel to Iran, it's said in many quarters. But I have one problem with the analysis, and that is that it doesn't address as far as America's capacity is concerned, and that is it assumes the ability to generate trust. And trust is something which is very difficult to generate. You see how easily statements are misunderstood in Egypt, not just then, but today, an American position. A source very close or very directly involved in the Israel-Palestine negotiations said to me last week that they had fallen apart not because of the political sideshows, which of course one always has, and which are regrettable, but because there just isn't, and of course the political will issue is right, but why is there a lack of political will? One reason is there's a lack of trust. There's too much history, as he said. And so even if we assume that the Israelis and Palestinians are not capable themselves, even if we assume that a balance of power in the region is desirable, shouldn't we be careful about the kind of wishful thinking as far as our role is concerned that assumes that we can generate trust where there will long be no trust?
Yes, I cannot question for a second the assertion that the United States cannot impose itself on two parties, and that in effect addresses a question I was asked earlier. But Gary, I have a slightly different view. I have a view about what is the right thing for the United States to do. That may be different than what the United States can accomplish. For the reasons you cite, it is very difficult. And you could have elaborated further and articulated the political differences inside of Israel and so on. You could have made it very clear that, but what is the right thing for the United States to do? If the United States sits, as happened during George W. Bush's administration, effectively on the sidelines, does nothing about the achievement of peace between Israelis and Palestinians, then instantly we are party to the problem. We have taken one party's side, and we will reap the consequences. The United States, and I would argue Europe, has no choice from our interests but to be involved, to try to build the bridges, and granted the gap is very wide, and to try to use the power of our intelligence and suasion and pressures to get the parties to come together without ever underestimating the challenge of trust that exists between the parties themselves. But our job, our responsibility is to define our policy and then try to design it in a manner that's sufficiently effective that it has a chance of being gripped by the parties themselves and lead to their decisions.
Well, that's a very eloquent lead into the first workshop of the American Academy's new Holbrooke Forum in June, which addresses the issue of statecraft and responsibility, because nothing's hurt us more than the charge of hypocrisy. And so it's important that we convey consistency in our values as part of our statecraft. And anyway, thank you so much for coming to Berlin, to the Academy.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much. Thank you.